Well, Professor Aviva Chomsky is a professor of history and coordinator of Latin American studies at Salem State University. She's the author of several books, including her newest book, Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. Professor Chomsky, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, it's so great to have you on. I absolutely loved Is Science Enough? Because you're thinking, you're writing, and you're researching the climate crisis and the way in which we try to frame things here on the show. I love that you write in the book how we, quote, how we identify cause will play a big role in how we conceptualize it, what we need to change, unquote. So what was it that made you want to write a book that actually looks at the real causes behind climate change?
So I'm so glad you zeroed in on that quote because, you know, I'm a historian. I study history of Latin America. And, you know, I don't seem to have any credentials to be writing about climate. I'm not a scientist. And I say right at the beginning of the book that, you know, there are so many people far more qualified than me who've written amazing books about the science of climate change. And I'm not going to even try to do that. But you know, when I study history and teach history, this issue of cause is a big issue for historians and how, like, there's many different ways we can identify causes. And one of my, part of my identity as a historian and the way I like to think about history is thinking about the significance of how far back we push causes. And you know, I teach a lot about global inequality because I teach about Latin America. And there are some really proximate causes that a lot of analysts look at without looking at deeper root causes. So the book that I wrote right before this is on Central American history, which is an area that I have no qualms about claiming to be an expert. And the title of it is Central America's Forgotten History, Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration. And because I feel like the debate about the roots of migration, and even when President Biden says, you know, we're going to attack the roots of migration, which are poverty, violence, and corruption, but he doesn't ask the next question, what are the roots of poverty, violence, and corruption? Like why it's kind of normalizes global economic inequality if we don't ask what are the roots of global economic inequality. So that's a lot of what I do in my classes and in my writing. And I was sort of seeing the same thing happening with discussions about climate change, that people talk a lot about the proximate causes, you know, CO2 emissions, burning fossil fuels. But I wanted to ask the questions, why are we burning so much fossil fuels and why are we unable to even having all of this scientific knowledge? And, you know, obviously we have more scientific knowledge now than we had 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, but we had all the science we needed 30, 40, 50 years ago to know that we are careening towards an emergency and we need to do something about it. Why have we been unable to politically deal with the science and make the decisions we need to make and make the changes that we need to make?
And let's be honest, like the lack of treating the climate crisis as a social, political, and economical issue, there has been fault certainly in a lot of the large big green groups, right, that have been center in the conversation around the climate crisis for decades. I see a lot of great examples and ways in which that is changing. And I think with the introduction of the Green New Deal, the centering of the conversation around climate justice, I actually do think things are changing. But obviously what I love about the conversation around the Green New Deal and around climate justice is this idea that we cannot just treat the climate crisis as a science issue, because we're going to fall back into those same political, social, and economic structures like you talk about and you write about that will just worsen inequality as we decarbonize, right? And so what are some of the biggest issues that you think about when we think about how we are decarbonizing the global energy structure?
Well, first of all, we aren't decarbonizing the global energy structure. For all the talk about decarbonization, it's not happening. That is, global emissions have been rising every year. There was a brief plateauing off in 2020 with all of the lockdowns for COVID, but except for that, we're not decarbonizing. We are simply not decarbonizing. We have slowly increased the use of alternative energies, solar, wind, but that has not cut into our use of fossil fuels. Our use of fossil fuels has not declined. So yeah, we're not decarbonizing. I think that the introduction of the Green New Deal, the concept of the Green New Deal, has been a really significant step in saying that, yes, we have to take a more socioeconomic political approach to this and understand what decarbonizing actually means. I think most of the pundits who talk about decarbonizing, again, are thinking of it as solely a technical issue and not even recognizing the technical issue that, first of all, increasing the use of alternative energy does not automatically lower the use of fossil fuels unless you're also holding flat or decreasing the total use of energy. Because if our use of energy is increasing, adding something else to the mix only means that the use of fossil fuels is increasing slightly more slowly than it would be otherwise. But the other thing that really came from a lesson that I learned back in 2012 when I was on for over a decade now, I've been taking delegations to Colombia, South America, to the coal mining region in Colombia to look at the impact of coal mining on Afro-descendant and indigenous rural peasant communities, which is something that's happening not just with this one coal mine in this one region of Colombia, but is happening all over the world. And you were mentioning the big green organizations. So the Sierra Club at that time was beginning its Beyond Coal campaign, and really trying to challenge the use of coal and move us away from coal, which is important. But in my town, for example, our coal-fired power plant is now a natural gas-fired power plant. So we are still burning fossil fuels despite the big campaign to close the coal-fired power plant. So there was somebody from the Sierra Club came on our delegation, somebody who was involved in the Beyond Coal campaign, and she spoke to one of the union leaders at the mine, the coal mine. And she said to him, "Don't you agree that we just have to stop burning coal?" And he said two things that I thought were so important and that I kind of feel like led me to write this book. First of all, he said, "You know what? You are asking the wrong person, because we export 100% of this coal, and most of it goes to the United States. So don't ask me if we should stop mining coal. We're not mining this coal for ourselves. We're mining it for you." So that's part of, when I think about root causes, like the United States is the biggest consumer of fossil fuels in the world. It's the biggest consumer per capita. It's the biggest historical consumer. Like climate change, the cause of climate change lies squarely at our doorstep. So all of this pontificating about what other countries should do, we need to be talking about what we need to do. And then the second thing he said that really opened my eyes to something I hadn't seen before is that, and don't think that you are going to be able to continue your profligate use of energy by switching to alternative sources, because there is no such thing as clean energy. Every form of energy has environmental costs. The sun may be clean, but the solar panels, and the batteries for storage and the infrastructure and the transmission, that is not clean. It all relies on mining. It relies on resources taken out of the earth, much of them coming from the third world, from poor countries, or from sacrifice zones inside your own country, which are generally inhabited by third world peoples of color, colonized people inside the United States. Native American reservations, for example. And the same thing with wind. The wind itself may be clean, but the windmills, and all of this requires land. It requires land use change, which means either deforestation or land taken out of agricultural use to be turned over to energy production use. And it requires machinery and infrastructure and batteries, all of which rely on resources that are taken out of the earth by miners like me. So if you intend to keep using energy, don't criticize me for taking resources out of the earth. So, you know, in a way, I didn't thank him in my acknowledgements, but I should have, because he really set me thinking about, okay, these are the things that we are not talking about, that we have to be talking about. And this is why global inequality is such an absolutely essential issue. And I wanted to say something else about the Green New Deal, since you brought it up. Now, the Green New Deal is a very capacious concept, right? It includes many different kinds of plans and ideas, and some very concrete plans and some very aspirational. You know, the Green New Deal proposal in Congress is very aspirational, but it doesn't have a lot of concrete. Okay, how are we going to do this? So the goals of it look beautiful, but it still is going to require a lot of, well, it's not going to pass anyway, but even if it were to pass, would require, that's only like the barest first step towards actually implementing some of these things. There's other proposals that are a little bit more clearly elaborated, and I especially look at the proposal called a Green New Deal for Europe, which comes not out of the EU. The EU has its own plan, which is basically greenwashing. I can talk more about greenwashing if you want, but it's a really important word too. But the Green New Deal for Europe, which comes out of social movements in Europe, leftist social movements, which is a really pretty well elaborated plan for how could we do this. But often the Green New Deal proposals think only at the national level. So they don't confront the issue of global economic inequality and the fact that significant portions of the world's population actually have no access to energy resources, to electricity, to basic transportation, to the energy resources that they need to fulfill basic human needs. So in some parts of the world, use of energy actually must increase. And that makes it even more incumbent on us to drastically decrease our use of energy if we want to, I mean, we really don't have a chance of holding the line at 1.5 degrees anymore. Like, that ship has sailed. But, you know, another thing I point out in the book, and that climate scientists also emphasize, is that this is not an all or nothing proposition, like 1.5, if we can't make the 1.5 degree goal, then let's just forget it. Every 1/10 of a degree after 1.5, as we move up towards 2 or 3 or 4, which is our current trajectory, is setting us towards 4 degrees, which will be absolutely catastrophic for over half of the world's population. But every 1/10 of a degree makes a huge difference. So even if we're not going to make the 1.5 goal, we still need to try to move as quickly as we can to hold it down as much as we can.
Yeah, I want to circle back to what you're talking about, the cost of energy. Obviously, we have to use the lowest impact, the lowest emission, the lowest polluting energy sources that we have available to us, and that we can scale. But as you mentioned, all energy does have a cost, and it's not a cost that we are unable to quantify. We can at least start to get an understanding of what the actual cost of energy is. So what are life cycle emissions, and why do they matter when we think about the accounting for emissions?
Okay, so when we count the emissions from fossil fuels, usually we're only counting the emissions from the actual burning of the fossil fuels, not all of the emissions that go into the extracting of the fossil fuels, the transportation of the fossil fuels, to say nothing of all of the wars that we carry out to control the use of fossil fuels, or access to fossil fuels, or the cost of fossil fuels, or the profits of the fossil fuel companies. So there's all kinds of hidden costs that go into a life cycle analysis. So, and that's essentially what this Colombian Union leader was referring to when he talked about the costs of solar and wind. That is, once the plants are built, they may be close to zero emissions, but building the infrastructure and maintaining the infrastructure creates emissions. So solar panels, of course, it depends on how much solar energy you're trying to produce. So, a single solar panel for the rooftop of a house costs less in terms of resources to produce than does a farm of solar panels to produce larger scale amounts of solar energy. But solar panels, the building of the solar panels of themselves requires rare earth minerals and also more common metals like copper that need to be extracted from the earth. And mining is a hugely destructive industry and a hugely energy intensive industry to literally rip up the earth to get it what's in it, and a lot of toxic chemicals. And then solar panels, and then there's the land use that is necessary that I mentioned before, that is every form of energy requires land, whether including land for the extraction of the resources, land for the production facilities for whatever it is, whether it's windmills or solar panels or lithium batteries, they have to be produced. And then land for where are the windmills going to be? Where are those solar farms going to be? And then there's the storage systems, because wind and solar are intermittent sources, so they require batteries, and the battery systems also require mining of resources and production facilities, and they have to be somewhere. So again, there's the land use piece of it, and then there's the transmission, that energy, once solar or wind is converted into energy, it needs to be stored and it needs to be transmitted. So a life cycle analysis looks at the emissions from every step of this. Oh, and then they have to be disposed of because they don't last forever. Solar panels last perhaps 20 to 40 years. So we're already, we've already filled the planet with electronic waste from all of the different electronics we use, and solar panels are toxic. And where are they going to be disposed of? Where are we going to dispose of all our trash? So there's life cycle emissions, and then there's also life cycle resource use that needs to be considered, because, I really like the way the Stockholm Environmental Institute has thought about planetary boundaries, that use of that CO2 and other, because it's not only CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, and some types of emissions are even worse than CO2, like methane and nitrous oxide, that and highly fluorinated chlorine gases that have an even more intense impact. We emit less of them than we do fossil fuels, but their impact on global warming is even stronger, exponentially stronger than that of fossil fuels. So those are also important components. But the greenhouse gas emissions and climate change are only one of 9 planetary boundaries that they identify. And they're all interrelated. That is, as temperatures rise, land fertility decreases. So land is one, water use is another, that is also, of course, affected by climate change, and it's affected by land use. Fertilizers, so there's all these different types of resources that we are overusing, both in terms of the resources themselves and the pollution that we cause by using them, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or whether it's toxic waste. So a real life cycle analysis looks at all of these things. What is the environmental impact? Now, that said, the life cycle emissions from solar and wind energy are still far less than are those from the burning of fossil fuels. So this is a transition that we absolutely have to make, but acknowledging the costs, not only in terms of life cycle emissions, but also other types of resource use and waste creation from massive infrastructure for solar and wind, makes us realize that those are also limited resources. The sun and the wind may be unlimited, but the ways that we harness them, those resources are limited. And once again, thinking about the issue of global economic inequality and the overuse of resources that's concentrated among the world's wealthiest people and the world's wealthiest countries. I think it's important to keep in mind both, that is, even in very poor countries, there's a super elite who are very high consumers of resources. In a wealthy country like the United States, and the United States really stands out. That is, we consume far more than to other people in other wealthy countries, Europe, Japan, that are also really high consumers, but we're like double what Japan and most European countries consume per capita. And that's not just because of our size, it's per capita that we're double their energy use. And it has to do with the way our society is organized. I think that the Green New Deal raises really, really important proposals, concepts, issues, ways of thinking about what we need to do. But in some ways, I feel like the Green New Deal doesn't even go far enough, even though it goes way too far to ever pass Congress. But I do feel like in some ways, raising these larger questions actually creates more hopeful scenarios, both in terms of what's possible, but also in terms of people's imaginations. And I think we really see this in Latin America, where indigenous movements have been at the forefront in the United States too, but with less power than in Latin America because of the relative size of the indigenous populations and the strength of the left and their involvement with other leftist social movements in Latin America, where indigenous movements have really proposed, and this has infiltrated a large segment of the left in Latin America, that the entire cultural and value structure of society needs to be rethought, and that rather than the idea of constantly increasing living standards and consumption, which is basically the goal of capitalism, keep producing and consuming more and more and more, understanding this idea of planetary boundaries, which comes from like European scientists, but it also comes from indigenous cosmologies, that the idea of buen vivir, sumat causai, or the good life, means living in harmony with the natural world and understanding the limits of the world that we live with, and a reciprocal relationship with the natural world rather than an extractive relationship with the natural world. And I actually think that is a concept that even many grotesque overconsumers like us find attractive. Like it's something they can grasp. Like, yes, there really is something wrong with the way we relate to the planet that we live on.
I thought when you wrote about carbon sequestration, this is one of the really fascinating parts of the book for me, because I think we've talked a lot on the show about how complicated carbon offsets can be, right? And what that could encourage, and how hard it is to actually determine what you are offsetting, when you are offsetting, how that is actually working. And, not to even get into all the technical dynamics for things like direct air capture and a lot of the technical fixes that are being proposed, being worked on, and being researched to pull carbon dioxide out of the sky. But as a history professor of Latin American studies, it's really interesting to see this sort of like neo-colonialist dynamics that even play out in something like carbon sequestration that I don't think I think of a lot about when we talk about on this show. So talk a little bit more about what you are seeing, some of the international issues that arise between the global north and Latin American countries when it comes to carbon sequestration.
Okay, so I'd like to separate sequestration from offsets, because they're two different issues, and both of them are really pertinent to the question you asked, but I'd like to sort of deal with them separately. But let's start with sequestration. The idea is that we're going to develop all these great new technologies and all this great new machinery and all this great new infrastructure, all of which, of course, causes a lot of emissions, so that we can keep burning fossil fuels, but instead of letting the CO2 emissions out into the atmosphere, we're going to capture them on the way. And then what exactly are we going to do with them? Well, nobody's quite sure, but maybe we can use them to extract more fossil fuels. That's one theory. Inject them underground to push the oil out. Or maybe we can just bury them underground somewhere. Most of this is a fantasy. That is, it may exist in some like theories in some laboratories, but in the real world, it doesn't exist yet. And one problem with it is that we don't have time. We need to stop emitting greenhouse gases now, not hope that 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, we're going to have a technology that allows us to continue burning fossil fuels without emitting this level of greenhouse gases. By then, it's going to be too late. A second problem with it is that it's aspirational. We don't even know if it's ever going to work. So counting on something that we don't even know if it's going to work, it's hugely expensive. It requires, as I was suggesting, large amounts of resources. And the question of where is all of the CO2 going to go is another one that, like, where does all of the toxic trash that we don't want go? It goes into areas where poor people live, where people of color live, where powerless people live, and that includes both inside the United States and in the third world. So with the amount of greenhouse gases that we're emitting, if it actually, the technology existed and were cost effective, and could be implemented on a huge scale, there would be an enormous amount of land that would have to be devoted to sequestering CO2. We also know nothing about the long-term impact, what the long-term impact of this would be. But I can guarantee you that it's not going to be in Elon Musk's backyard. So I think there's an implicit, huge environmental justice question about where is all of this going to take place and who is going to be paying the costs for it. And, I think we know the answer because we know the answer to all environmental justice questions. We know who pays the cost of our environmental destruction in all respects. So, but I think that sequestration is a very attractive idea for those who believe that we just need a little more technology and that's going to save us from everything. The truth is we already have all of the knowledge, all of the science, all of the technology we need. We just need the political will. And as I was saying earlier, it's political socioeconomic change is really at the heart of what we need to be thinking about if we want to reduce emissions, not waiting for the next magical scientific discovery, but doing what we know how to do right now. Humans have been living with low emissions for many tens of thousands of years, and much of the world lives with very low emissions right now. And much of the world lives with much lower emissions than us, with basic social needs met. And this is another interesting thing that the planetary boundaries research looks at. So how much energy do you actually need to meet basic social needs, basic human needs, food, shelter, healthcare, education? A lot of what is really important to functioning human societies and to human happiness does not require a lot of emissions, does not require a lot of energy use. Education, for example, basic primary health care, peasant agriculture and food production. And peasant agriculture is what feeds most of the poor people in the world. And it is the most sustainable kind of agriculture, as opposed to industrial agriculture, which makes a lot of profits for corporations and puts a lot of junk foods on our plates. Okay, so that's sequestration. I also wanted to say something about offsets, because that's another kind of comforting myth that, oh, well, we don't really have to make any big changes because we can buy offsets. So the concept of offsets is you keep burning fossil fuels, but whether as an individual or as a company, a business, or even a country, you do something to, quote, offset the emissions that you're creating. Now, what does it mean to offset the emissions? Well, it could mean planting trees. It could mean investing in green energy. Like all of this is, like offsetting really doesn't mean anything. It's just however the law is going to define what it means to offset. But built into some of the climate agreements is this concept of offsetting, and a whole elaboration of how rich over consumers can once again use poor countries and the third world and the lands of poor people to salve their consciences for their overuse of energy, often in ways that are highly detrimental to the poor people and poor countries where they are investing in these projects. So the research that has been done into offset projects, like planting a forest in some poor third world country, well, where exactly is that forest going to be planted? And what is the definition of a forest? This is another thing, because the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, actually defines a forest, and these forests that can be planted can actually be plantations that are planted in order to be cut down. So the preservation of a forest or the planting of a forest is often a corporate profitability project. And a forest that's planted or preserved can also be cut down the next day. So, you say you're creating these offsets, but there's no guarantee in the long term that there's going to be any continued offsetting. But often these projects are also done on lands where there are people living, lands that are under agricultural production, lands where people are living off the land, whether through foraging, hunting, gathering, or through farming. And then those people are then pushed off the land so that it can be used for a corporate profit project that is then called offsetting emissions. So, and there's also emissions involved in many of these projects, like jet setting people around the world to implement the projects. And even the climate meetings themselves, like just moving thousands of people around the world so they can stay in fancy hotels and talk to each other. It's like all so grotesque. So that they can talk to each other and decide to do nothing, which is basically what the climate agreements are doing.
I think we've kind of hinted at this in the conversation. You kind of hint at it in the book and then address it later on in the book. But that's the degrowth movement, right? And this is a part of your book. This has been a big part of the conversation around the economics of the climate crisis. And as you note, it is a controversial one. So I'm curious, where do you fall, or how do you feel about the degrowth movement, and what place do you think it actually has in the conversation around the climate crisis?
I think it has a really central place in the conversation around the climate crisis. And in a way, I go back again to the Colombian Union leader saying, don't look at us, look at yourself. You're the ones who are burning this coal. We're mining this coal for you. That I think I come to degrowth from a different place than many people do, although there's also many people who come to it from my place. But I think that the economists who first started elaborating degrowth, or or at least some of them, were thinking essentially, and it really originated in Europe, not in the United States. It's been much slower to catch on in the US, though I think it's starting to infiltrate a little bit here too. European economists who were looking kind of more internally at Europe's economy, which they see as an overgrown economy. But the concept of degrowth is very closely related to the concept of planetary boundaries. But from a Latin American perspective, it's also very closely related to colonialism and imperialism and extractivism and to indigenous cosmologies. So there's sort of a constellation of where I think degrowth comes in. So what is degrowth? So capitalist economics, which is the economics of at least the past 300 years, industrial capitalism, is based on the idea of economic growth, that economies must grow. We must produce and consume more and more. And that is how standards of living rise. And it's also how corporations make profits by producing more and more and getting people to consume more and more. And it's built into the system that it must grow, that profits have to stay up and increase, and that human progress is based on the idea of economic growth, that we should constantly be producing and consuming and inventing more and more and more. This is really a relatively new idea in human history. And the idea of a steady state economy has always, is much more characteristic of the way humans have lived on the planet for tens of thousands of years. That is basically that you produce what you need to fulfill basic human needs. And there's no need to produce more than that. And that there's other forms of human satisfaction besides just producing and consuming more. So, there's, social life and festivals and what we would call the caring economy. It doesn't require constant growth and improvement. It gets satisfaction out of the dailiness. Now, of course, industrial society has brought huge gains for humans. It's also created huge suffering for humans, especially colonized humans, whether enslaved people or people who are pushed off their land. Just thinking about the United States, but also thinking globally, that industrial society is based on this unequal relationship of extraction of land and labor from primarily people of color, from primarily by white people, Europeans, and the white country of the United States. And I say that very deliberately because until the Civil War, the United States was explicitly a white country, a country by foreign of white people. So, and even after the Civil War, that has remained, much of that has remained in the ethos and the politics and economics of the country. White countries and colonizing countries. So industrialization and colonization cannot be separated from each other. That is, industrialization has meant improving the standards of living of the few at the expense of the many. Nevertheless, we are where we are right now. So there are certainly benefits of industrial society that I would say, rather than trying to constantly increase those benefits, we need to redistribute those benefits. That is, and not everything that industrial society has accomplished has really been a benefit, but we can talk about that too. And if you just think about cars, for example, of course, cars seem like a great benefit to people. They get you places faster. They're so convenient. Of course, they also are a really inefficient use of the planet's resources, and public transit is a much more logical way to distribute resources in a rational way to actually meet human needs than letting a few people have extremely destructive cars. But the other thing about cars is that the more cars you produce, the more roads you need, and the more traffic you have. And most people with cars spend hours every week sitting in their cars in traffic. So again, it's an irrational system. It's based on growth and profit, but it's growth that actually is harmful in many ways. And, I just came back from spending a month in Japan, and like, wow, you want to see public transportation? I know, of course, there's many places in the world that have excellent public transportation, but it certainly is possible for an advanced industrial society to create a public transportation system that is efficient and clean and wonderful, and why would anybody even want a car when it's so convenient to use public transit? Obviously, we don't have that. I don't think we have that anywhere here in the United States. I think the question of redistribution and equality is also really central to degrowth. That is, to understanding what overgrowth means, and understanding the central role of growth in the capitalist system, and how capitalism itself needs to be either abolished or strongly regulated to bring us down in the overdeveloped countries to a level where we can continue to enjoy just moving on to one other issue of healthcare, where we see in the United States how poorly capitalism functions in an area like healthcare, where if everything is for profit, like, yes, we have incredible healthcare, but it's only accessible to the few. And even basic primary care is not accessible to a significant portion, not only of the planet's population, but even of the population of the United States. So that would be another example where, instead of developing more and more advanced treatments for a more and more tiny and rarefied portion of the world's population, a rational distribution of healthcare would be a degrowth approach, where basic healthcare needs to be accessible to everybody. So for people in the third world, again, the third world is highly unequal, as is the first world. So not to overgeneralize, because there's people in the third world who are huge overconsumers of everything as well. There are many people who do need to consume more. There are areas of the economy that need to grow for people to have their basic human needs met. But with redistribution, rather than increasing production as the sort of essential concept of how we can make life better for people, I think that the idea of indigenous cosmologies and living in harmony with the natural world, the ideas of planetary boundaries, and the ideas of degrowth for the overgrown economies, in order to have a more just global economic system and access to quality of life for the world's whole population within the boundaries of the planet.
Yeah, I think if you just drill down to the United States, kind of getting out of the degrowth conversation, just drilling down in the United States, there has long been this tension between people that want to attack the climate crisis and members of unions, right? And this has been, and I love how you write in the book how it's so important to understand the history of these dynamics to understand the conversation itself. And to be frank, as someone that talks a lot about climate change, to see where climate activists and climate groups have made errors in not centering labor in the conversation around the climate crisis, and why that is so critical to attack, again, attacking the same political and economic and social structures that have gotten us into this mess. We should be centering labor in this conversation. So what is it really important for people who are concerned about the climate crisis to understand when it comes to the dynamics between unions and environmentalists?
So I'm really glad you asked that question. And I think we also, when we talk about labor, need to point out that the unionized sector of the labor force in the United States is actually quite small. It's hovering around 6 to 7%. So unions are very important, but historically, if you go back, how many years, 50, 60, 70 years, we had a much larger proportion of the labor force was unionized, 35%. We never got above that. There's some places that have higher percentages than that, but there was a period in the say 1940s to 1970s, where the labor movement had a much stronger presence in the political life of the country. And that the attack on the labor movement has, since the 1970s, has actually been part of the attack on the environment in the interests of raising corporate profits and economic growth. So, but I think it's also important to look at, and so a strong labor movement has been, both in the United States and worldwide, a really key factor in getting a fairer share of the pie, of a more redistributive economic model, at least domestically. And this is one of the problems with the labor movement in the United States, has been well, I'll talk a little bit more about the history, but certainly during that period, at least, its tendency to think in very nationalistic terms, like that there's an American standard of living and that, yes, US workers deserve a fair share of this American and access to this American standard of living, without acknowledging what that meant for the rest of the world and the extent to which an American standard of living is dependent on the colonization of resources of the rest of the world, the extraction of resources, the export of pollution and trash and CO2 emissions has been the oversized role of the United States in CO2 emissions has been talked about as colonization of the atmospheric commons. That is, the atmosphere is also a common resource that belongs to everybody on the planet, and the United States is using far more than its fair share. So there's something problematic about the idea of the American standard of living, but if we think just within the national terms, the strength of unions has been a really important factor in the idea of a more redistributive economy within the United States and a more fair share for the working people of the United States. There's also been, so the labor movement in the United States, of course, as in every country, has included many different tendencies, and there have been much more internationalist tendencies within the labor movement, but the main labor confederation, the AFL-CIO, and the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, going all the way back to its founding in the late 19th century, has operated very much in these sort of nationalist terms and also racist terms. If you look back at the history of the AFL, it was really a white guys union that cared very little. It cared about redistribution, but only to the skilled white workers. So the question is, how big do you think when you think about redistribution and who deserves a fair share of the pie? So one of the things that the Green New Deal does and doesn't do is think about the role of labor, because decreasing production, even in only specific sectors like the fossil fuel sector, means that people are going to lose jobs. And in the current organization of our economy, the loss of a job is devastating, because when you lose your job, you lose your healthcare, you lose your access to all of your basic human needs, to housing because you have to pay for it, to food because you have to pay for it, to education for your children, certainly beyond elementary school, primary and secondary school, to higher education. You lose access to your basic human needs if you lose your job. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. That economy doesn't have to function that way. We could have an economy that guaranteed access to basic human needs like housing and healthcare and food and childcare and education, but we don't because we have a capitalist economy. But so talking about scaling down harmful industries without talking about, well, what about the people who work in those industries and how are they going to be affected and how are their livelihoods going to be protected? That's one of the things that the Green New Deal tried to do, and by bringing in the concept of a just transition. So for people who are harmed by the closure of harmful industries, there has to be retraining, there has to be social supports, there has to be guarantees. So the Green New Deal brings that into the center of the conversation. And the Green New Deal, and I'm talking here about the Markey Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal proposal, because as I said, there's many Green New Deals out there that do things in different ways. Their proposal went even beyond just thinking about the workers who are going to lose their jobs. They also include what they call frontline communities. That is, what about the people who are affected by these toxic industries? What about the people who in Appalachia who live in areas where there's coal mines, not necessarily the people who work for the coal mines, but what happens when a coal mine closes? What happens to the people who live in the community, not just the workers there themselves, but coal mines themselves are hugely toxic industries. They leave a devastated landscape. What happens to all the people who live there? So talking about frontline communities, they're talking about the people who, this is really an environmental justice question, the people who have been negatively affected by industries, who also need the social supports and protections and remediation and reparations for the harms that they have suffered. So the Green New Deal goes beyond just the direct workers into the frontline communities that are affected in different ways. So all of those things are really important. But two things that the Green New Deal proposal failed to do. One is that it actually failed to include the labor movement in the discussions and the elaboration of the proposal. So the reaction of the then president of the AFL-CIO, Richard Trumka, was, you never talked to us about this. Like, you just went ahead and designed it. Like, where's the voice of labor in designing this? So, and I think, so that is one problem. The other thing is that it really continues to think just at the level of redistribution within the United States, and not taking into account the extent to which the idea of an American standard of living depends upon extraction and exploitation from other parts of the world, colonized, formerly colonized, currently neo-colonized parts of the world. So thinking globally and including labor in the conversation is an important piece of it. But, you know, I was saying that the labor movement, the organized labor only represents 7% of the working class in the United States. And there's many, many workers who have no relationship to the labor movement, even though a strong labor movement benefits all workers by raising the floor, by pushing for protective legislation, by pushing for things like unemployment insurance, things that help all workers, not only unionized workers. But as the labor movement has been under assault in the United States, and so there's always been this tension within the labor movement in the US as to what extent do we represent all workers and to what extent do we represent the workers in our particular union at the expense of others. So there's been huge sectors that have been left out, like domestic workers, like agricultural workers, that were left out of all the protective labor legislation that unions pushed for in the mid-century. Things like Social Security, safe working conditions, wages, hours. So there's a lot of the care workers, which is a term that I think came into common use during COVID and is a really important term, who do the most essential work, essential workers or care workers, have been left out of organized labor and are not organized. Now, there has been a push within the labor movement to organize some of these workers recently, and that this is ongoing, but still it's a tiny, tiny percentage. So what do we even recognize as labor? Who do we recognize as workers? What does labor law cover? This is another question. And to what extent is this global? Like, don't we need a global minimum wage to protect workers everywhere rather than just protecting certain sectors of workers in certain places? So those are just some of the complicated questions about labor. But I should say that the environmental movement so there's a strong history of labor environmentalism too that needs to be talked about. But the mainstream environmental movement has been kind of separate from the labor movement and kind of thought of workers as just selfish people who only care about their jobs and don't care about the environment. On the other hand, labor environment, so that's one of the things that has sort of caused this division. But labor environmentalism, that is, workers are often on the front line of exposure to toxic chemicals, exposure to pollution, and the role of the labor movement itself in pushing for health and safety and environmental remediation and reparations and protections is also an important piece to look at. That's a long, complicated answer.
No, it's a really, really complicated issue. And I just want to ask you about one other really complicated issue here as we wrap up, which is democracy in the climate crisis. As we're just months away from COP27, the COP process, and we did, I think, 20 episodes on COP26 last year. The Conference of the Parties is this imperfect, complicated process. You have so many fossil fuel interests that are there at every conference. At the same time, there are so many member countries that are participating. I think it's something like 192. I'm sure I'm getting that number wrong, but there's a lot of countries that can participate and that are required to get an agreement at these COP events. And so you do see negotiations of what a global agreement can be, right? And again, there's so many fossil fuel interests entrenched in those politicians and literally physically presence. We have to recognize that. And we see so many examples across the globe where democracy is being threatened. In the United States, we're having this conversation of what ongoing threats to our own democracy may occur. So when we think about whether it's the United States or whether it's international agreements, when we think about the concept of democracy and its importance in the climate fight, what are you going to be watching? What should we be concerned about when we think about global democracy?
That is a really big and complicated question. So, you say that democracy is threatened. And I think that has become a big part of the conversation right now. But I think that there's an assumption that perfect democracy exists, but it's under threat by people like Donald Trump and, autocrats and authoritarians. And I would say democracy is not just like something great that exists and is threatened. Democracy does not exist. And you mentioned some of the reasons why, like even just the presence and influence of fossil fuel industries in the climate talks, to say nothing of their influence in government in the United States and elsewhere. That is, third world countries, poor countries, really are not sovereign at all. So even if they have a kind of democracy where they have elections, even their elected governments have very little sovereignty and autonomy in the global economy. Colonialism now takes place through technocrats. It takes place through USAID. It takes place through the IMF and the World Bank and trade agreements that are negotiated among elites to promote corporate interests. So there's no democracy in the most important areas where governance should be taking place. There is no democracy. So I think we need to recognize how flawed democracy is to begin with. And if democracy means meaningful participation in the decisions that are important to your life, most people don't, even in the United States, don't believe that we have much democracy. Everything happens behind closed doors. We have no idea how or why. You know, you go vote every 4 years, and yeah, you want that to be important, but you really have no meaningful way of being involved in the decision-making process of the decisions that are most important to you. It's all done by important people out there, elites. So I think we need to expand the conversation from, well, democracy is threatened. We have a great democracy, but it's threatened by Donald Trump, to we need much more democracy, both inside the United States and globally, so that the voices of people who are truly affected by climate change, by emissions, by land grabs, by global economic inequality, actually have a forum to make their voices heard and to have an impact on these decisions. Not that these decisions should be made behind closed doors.
That is very well said and a great way of wrapping up the conversation. Again, I think if you want to understand and have such a really, this is such a good book, I think, to better understand the power dynamics around the climate crisis. This is also a great book to buy for other people. And I would say that that's about a few, you know, as you imagine, we read quite a few books on the show. This is a great one to have other people in your life to better understand the climate crisis and how we got here. Again, the book is called Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. Professor Chomsky, thank you again for joining me on the Climate Pod.
Thanks so much for having me.